The night they told me I was ridiculous, that I'd embarrass the family, I stood in the doorway of our kitchen and watched the light leak out of the room like a bad omen. My cousin's laugh rode the air first, sharp and loud, then folded into a chorus of groans as my mother whispered, "What a waste." My father didn't say a word. His silence was louder than any insult, and I knew in that instant I would choose a different road or I would die under the weight of that word. Ridiculous. But I didn't die. I left. The pain of departure was a constant ache for years, a soundtrack I learned to live with. I was a data scientist, quiet, precise, the kind who could translate a messy climate anomaly into a chart that smelled like math and truth. Then a door slammed in a different way. The day I stood in a conference hall and was publicly dismissed for exposing flaws in climate data. The room hadn't contained my colleagues' disbelief. It was stacked with the other kind of trust, the trust that good science must be accepted. I was accused of cherry-picking, of manipulating the narrative, of politics wearing a white coat. The character assassination followed like a noose they tried to tie around my neck in public. And still, a stubborn part of me whispered, "You don't belong here anymore. You belong with the land itself." That whisper grew into a pivot. Eco-Archaeology. What a strange, glorious phrase, a field that blends environmental science with ancient human history. It sounded like a joke to the skeptics, the same way my family had once called my dream ridiculous. But I was learning to listen to the Earth's long memory, the strata that tell you where water hid, where pollen moved, where rivers shifted and civilizations learned to adapt. I studied not to prove anyone right, but to understand resilience. If climate data failed in the minds of the powerful, perhaps the soil could bear witness in a different dialect. The early years were a marathon of humiliations disguised as progress. Grants denied, timelines slipping, the echo of the ridicule that had haunted my childhood echoing in every new conference audience. People called me pseudoscience, a buzzword meant to dismiss the uneasy truth that data could be uncomfortable when it demanded real change. Still, I kept going. Translating the stubborn stories locked in rock and seed and salt. And I learned that we do not conquer the land by shouting at it, we coax it into speaking back, through roots, through moisture, through the way microbes remember to cling. And then the turning point arrived with quiet force. I began to see barren hills awaken, not with a single miracle, but with a chorus of small, stubborn acts. Reeds found water in a dry wadi. A terraced wall, long forgotten, held soil in place long enough for a seed to root. The community saw the hills they had mourned as loss suddenly echo with life, sparrows returning to the hedgerows, dragonflies skimming the new ponds, the air tasting like rain that had remembered how to fall. I wasn't just mapping data. I was listening to the earth tell its own version of a comeback story, and I was learning to translate it into something governments could act on. The fieldwork was a crucible. I learned to balance skepticism with courage, to stand in front of funding panels and say, we can rebuild a landscape if we understand its history. There were days when the work felt like dragging a boulder uphill, the physical exertion, the bureaucratic stubbornness, the endless sea of charts and chlorophyll readings. And there were nights when a simple observation, pollen grains preserved in a clay shard, a fossilized reed, felt like a letter from the ancestors, asking us to remember that resilience is a practice as old as human settlement itself. Slowly, the world started listening. Not to me exactly, but to the evidence that eco-archaeology could rescue climates by reweaving human habit with the land's memory. I began to see a field of triumph emerge. Transforming deserts into living systems that captured carbon, rebuilt water cycles, and gave communities a stake in stewardship again. The work wasn't glamorous in the way a movie montage is. It was labor, patience, and the stubborn insistence that the past could instruct the present. And the data finally found its audience, not as a weapon to strike fear into policymakers, but as a guide to practical resilience. Global acclaim came, not as a single thunderclap. I spoke at climate summits, stood on research platforms that carried more continents than I'd ever seen, and watched the skeptic-y tilt of eyebrows become a respectful nod. The work was recognized as Eco-Archaeology for climate resilience, a name I'd once feared would be ridiculed into oblivion, now worn as a badge of possibility. The earth accepted my questions with patient, stubborn honesty, and offered me its answers in the form of restored streams and dew on the morning grass. And then I returned home. I came back to the same kitchen where the word ridiculous had once burned into the night air like a cigarette's last ember. The smell of coffee and pine, the creak of the old floorboard, the same walls that had seen the first wave of judgment. They were still there, my family, though some faces had grown older, some a little wiser. I did not seek their approval, not in the old way. But I did want them to see what their mocking had tried to steal from me, and what love and stubborn work had made instead. The unforgettable scene happened in the valley behind our house, a place they'd once called barren, a place the family had muttered would never yield more than dust and disappointment. I invited them to walk with me along a path I'd carved over years of fieldwork, a ribbon of green threading through a landscape that had learned to remember. We reached an overlook where the land fell away to a valley that used to be a graveyard for soils, saline soils, eroded terraces, a map of failures. Now the valley breathed. Orchards stood where there had been nothing but climate anxiety. Wetlands winked with life where there had been dust-patched dryness. A small crowd of people gathered, neighbors, children, the same rooms that had once mocked me at the family table. Look, I said, not to brag, but to anchor them in truth. Look at what you said would never happen. Look at what a long-held memory of the land, what a patient science, what a stubborn dream, what a family skepticism all of it has brought back. The proof wasn't a trophy or a headline, though those followed. It was in the air, in the bees that found a hive along the hedgerows, in the children who rode bicycles along the restored terraces, in the elders who watched the land turn green again and whispered, "Maybe we were wrong about him." My father's shoulders slackened a fraction, the backbone of pride returning to him in a way that didn't need applause. My mother's eyes glistened, not with hurt, but with a newly earned respect that they hadn't shown before. My sister, who had always laughed when I spoke about pollen and sediment, finally asked, softly, "How did you know?" And I answered the way a person does when they have learned the language of their own history. I didn't know at first. I learned. That day I offered them a ledger of truth, a karma's ledger, if you will. Debts paid, years of doubt turned into fields of grain and shade. Interest earned, the trust of communities who now fight for restoration in their own backyards. The final balance was simple. Dignity earned through work that refuses to quit and loves the land more steadfastly than fear loves a quiet life. We stood together as the sun dropped low, and the land exhaled a wind that tasted of rain and memory. My family, once masters of mockery, watched the landscape's return with a humility I had always hoped to see, but rarely believed would come. They saw me, not as the ridiculous dreamer, but as someone who had learned how to read the earth's ledger, the way it records every drought conquered, every seed that found its way home, every human ego humbled by an honest, stubborn kind of hope. And I learned something in return. A dream that seemed ridiculous to those who could not hear the land's whispers is not a betrayal of reality, but a patient invitation to reality's deeper intelligence. I did not abandon them to their past. I invited them into a future where the dream doesn't laugh at you,